Pat, how old were you when you put your first pair of skates on?
My first pair of skates, my auntie, my auntie bought me a second-hand pair of skates when I was 14. But let me tell you, I used to stand outside St. Moritz and smell the cold and try to imagine what it was like in this ice rink. I was so fascinated with it all. And my auntie bought me a pair of second-hand ice skates, and I was off.
So when you got those skates, that was the first time you skated?
Yes,
And
I was.
you fell in love with it straight away?
Absolutely, because Sonia Heaney was at her height and she was so glamorous and she made all these beautiful movies. And we lived through the movies in those days. And so I was going to be a budding Sonia Heaney.
Do you remember any of the specific titles for the films that you were watching with Sonia Heaney in them?
Yes, I can remember one. It happened in Sun Valley. That was beautiful. And there were a lot of beautiful movies she made. They always had lovely love story. Tyrone Power was in one of them with her. She had lovely leading men too.
Yeah, always the benefit of being a beautiful skater.
Absolutely.
So, was there a point at which you decided that skating would become your life? I know that you had the idea that you might follow in Sonia Heaney's footsteps, but what happened that you, I suppose, turned professional?
Yes, I turned professional. I was very, very lucky. David Martin, who managed the Tivoli for years, he used to go to Europe and pick up the shows, and he went to Europe and there was this ice show called Ice Folly. Armand Perrin was the owner of the show, and they were stranded in Milan in Italy with a shonky entrepreneur. So David Martin, who was a very clever man, said, well, I'll pay all your fares home if you sign contracts to come to Australia. In those days, Equity had a bit of power, and they said, well, if you're bringing a show to Australia, you have to use some Australian talent. So they auditioned all over Australia, and there were 6 Australian girls chosen to skate in the show. So we did a tour of Australia and New Zealand. We played for 10 months at the Tivoli in Sydney, broke all records. Absolutely wonderful it was.
So how old were you when this happened?
I was 18.
So it's a very quick, from 14 getting your first pair of skates to 18 on a international tour.
It was a very, very quick trip, but I was determined to become an expert skater, and I worked hard at it. I didn't have a lot of lessons. We really didn't have the money to be spending a lot of money on lessons, but the lessons I did have, I went away and worked on them. And luck's a fortune. I think it's all about being in the right place at the right time. And the ice show came to Australia just when I was at my peak. I was teaching ice skating at St. Moritz at the time.
So if you say luck's a fortune, what happened next that kept you going in this career?
Well, having a taste of show business, touring Australia and New Zealand, and my boyfriend at the time was Graham Argue. I met him when I was 16. He was an ice hockey player. I left the show, we got married, and I was back teaching at St. Moritz. Graham was in his job, and they sent me a telegram saying, would I like to join the show again? So I spoke to Graham to see what he thought. His parents were absolutely appalled. His father said I'd turned him into a gigolo. So off we went to New Zealand, we rehearsed in Sydney with another production called Hot Ice. And Pat Gregory was in that. She was Australia's very, very top skater. She'd skated internationally. She'd come back to Australia, and she and her husband influenced Graham and I to pack up and go to, they said, you two go to Europe before you settle down. So after New Zealand, off we went to England. We arrived with 10 pounds. Graham hired a Daimler to take me up from the ship to Sloane Square, where we had digs, and then we joined a touring show, White Horse Inn on Ice, which we toured in for about 18 months. We did a Moss Empire tour, and then we had the opportunity to go to Gothenburg in Sweden to join Sonia Heaney in the ultimate of ice companies, the famous Holiday on Ice. So we arrived in Gothenburg, and the manager met us and took us out for coffee, and he said, "Oh, I have to get to the building, Sonia Heaney's rehearsing." Well, with that, you can imagine, I nearly fainted. So off we went and met Sonia Heaney and joined the company.
So when you arrived in England, how old were you then?
Oh, let me see. We were already married then. I was married when I was 21, so we went to England. We went to England in about 52 we were married. We went to England in about 54. Because interestingly enough, England was still on food rationing, and then we went to Germany. They weren't on food rationing.
Strange, isn't it?
Unbelievable.
So you mentioned that Graham was an ice hockey player.
Yes.
And how was he as a skater?
Oh, a very good skater. An ice hockey skater, ice hockey player, speed skater. But ice hockey, they wear different skates altogether. And when we turned up to rehearsals, he had his hockey skates. So Armin parents said, what's with the skates? Oh, he said, my figure skates are being repaired. But he was a very, very good skater.
Did he have to catch up with you in terms of figure skating?
He had to adapt a little bit because using the hands and doing all the fancy stuff didn't come easily to him. But eventually in Holiday on Ice, he ended up doing one of the major comedy routines.
And so what, by the time you're 24, 25, you're skating with Holiday on Ice.
Yes.
You've met Sonia Heaney.
Mm-hmm.
How did that feel? Do you remember how it felt to have kind of reached that stage? Because again, it's only a decade, and you've had a dream, and you've reached it.
Oh, it was just, we couldn't believe the sort of life we were leading. We took our chances. We didn't have much behind us, but we had the opportunity, and we felt we can't let this opportunity go. How many people can go and do work at what they love? And we toured Europe for 3 years. Well, we did weekend shows in the afternoon, but it was mainly night shows, which meant we had the days to go and sightsee, and at night you went out and enjoyed the nightlife. So it was just too good to be true.
And was there, real luck, I suppose, for the both of you, for you and Graham, that you met each other? Because, to do it alone would be a different sort of fun, but to do it with someone you're married to and you love must have been fantastic.
Absolutely. The single people who have gone to Holiday on Ice have never ever enjoyed it as much as a couple. If you're a couple, you can get away from the mainstream and do your own thing. And we could have hung around in England and got better jobs, got principal jobs maybe, but our whole purpose was to see the world and get paid for it. And it wasn't going to be permanent.
So, but when you were with Holiday on Ice, did you tour the world?
We toured the world, yes. Well, we toured Europe. We stayed in Europe for 3 years, and when the opportunity to go to South America came up, I was fairly keen to get home by then. I felt this is not a down-to-earth life, and I felt it was time to come home and have a family. Graham would have kept going and going and going. So I agreed that as it happened, I became pregnant in South Africa, and Graham went to South America, and I came home, and he arrived home about 3 months before Greg was born.
Do you have, of that time that you were touring, do you have a fondest memory, something, a particular occasion or a particular show that you put on that really is a very fond memory for you?
Oh, Italy was lovely because eventually we bought a little car, but before we had our car, the manager of the company had a car, but he didn't drive. So he used to say, would you like to go down to Sorrento for dinner tonight? So we'd drive down, and there was a beautiful restaurant at the end of the pier. We'd go and sit and have a beautiful dinner at night. It was just unbelievable.
Were there ever any lows? Was there ever anything that kind of I know that you wanted to come back because you wanted to settle, but was there ever a time where you were over it, that it wasn't working?
There were times in the winter. The buildings weren't like they are these days in Europe. We'd be standing around in a cold, drafty building with hardly any clothes on, with the coal coming off the ice, freezing until the show started. Once the show started, you warmed up. And I used to think to myself sometimes, what am I doing here? Then we'd have early morning train calls, and or 2 o'clock in the morning, you'd get a train from Frankfurt to Copenhagen. Then when you arrive, you have to get around and find digs, and it's like everything. There's a yin and a yang. It can't all be good.
And did you ever go through North America?
No. I have friends who did the American tour, and they said it wasn't anything like Europe because every town they went to, it was just another motel. They were still in America, another motel. And the thing that saved out boredom with the work, when I say boredom, when you're doing the same thing all the time, it can get a bit boring, but we're in new countries all the time.
So you were back in Australia, you arrived back in Australia, what would be about 1956, 57?
57.
57. And you were pregnant. You had your firstborn, Greg.
Yes.
Graham came back to join you, and you remained in skating.
Not really. No. We became very suburban when we first came home, and then one of my friends, Nancy Burley, they had an ice rink in Ringwood. She'd been to Holiday on Ice. A lot of Australians have toured with Holiday on Ice. She used to do ice shows at Channel 2. We did a series of ice shows at Channel 2, which Graham and I enjoyed because it was in our hometown. And then I did a show at the Tivoli, and I did another show at the Lido Theatre Restaurant. So there was always something happening.
And there was a stage though where you actually owned and managed a ring?
Yes, and from when we did the Lido show, David McElraith came to us one day. Do you remember David McElraith?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
He came and he said, "Oh, we're taking a show to Hong Kong." He was all excited, and one of the skaters went out and purchased a portable ice rink on the strength of going to Hong Kong. Well, it didn't happen. And Graham had a transport business at the time, and this fellow who had bought the rink came to Graham and he said, "Look, I've got this ice rink I've bought. I've got nowhere to put it. I've got nothing to do with it." And because Graham had the storage, he said, "Can I leave it with you?" And so Graham stored it at his depot. Then the opportunity came up to do a small tank show, and we started doing our small professional show around the shopping centres as promotional shows. All the shopping centres we did. We did Moomba for 15 years regularly. We did the Royal Sydney show, 2 motor shows for General Motors, Melbourne and Sydney. And from that, Graham formed a company and built an ice rink with 17 shareholders, which is still going today. We ran that for 15 years, and they were very good years.
So you've never really lived a fully suburban life, have you?
Never. Maybe now, closest, if you call this suburban.
So Greg was born first, then David?
Yes.
How soon after the boys were born, or how old were they when you were actually back into skating, doing the shows? And
Oh, well, David was only a baby because one of the Channel 2 shows, Graham was dressed up as a Spanish lady, and I had David down there with me, and Graham came up and said, "Hello, darling, how are you?" And David looked at him, couldn't believe what he was seeing. His father all dressed up in a frilly skirt with the black hair and eyelashes. So that was an early introduction. No wonder David ended up in showbiz.
do you think that's true? Do you think, because what you're talking about basically, we can call it ice skating, but it really is show business.
Oh, definitely.
And
most definitely.
David's been around that all his life. So do you think that is why David ended up in show business?
Possibly, but I think David was a born actor and show business person. Everything he has ever done has been instinctive. And that's possibly why it's a little bit difficult to direct David, because, you know, he can be a bit difficult to direct, because what he does just comes. Yeah, and my other son, Greg, he and his girlfriend went off to Holiday on Ice, and they toured with some of the same people that we had worked with. Greg was drummer.
That must have been interesting.
Yeah. History repeating itself.
Yeah. But all you know, it's a big family, and it just sounds like a big family as well. And both the boys skate.
Oh yes, yeah.
And
And Michelle skates.
So they all started very young.
Yeah. Oh yeah,
Couldn't
very
avoid it.
young. Yeah, very young. Yes. Couldn't wait to get on the ice.
And do you ever get back on the ice now? Do you ever?
I haven't been on the ice for about 5 years now, but I did get on the ice. David and I skated at the Rockefeller Center in New York, which was absolutely fantastic.
For when you made the film, when you were
When we
doing
made the film,
doing the
yes.
RUs, yeah.
Yeah.
How did it feel to skate with David at the
On a
Rockefeller Center?
plane, if you want to just pause.
Okay, we'll wait. Wait for the small plane to pass over.
No.
So Pat, what was it like to skate with David at the Rockefeller Center when you were shooting the film?
Oh, that was fantastic. I mean, how many mothers at 75 get to skate with their son at the Rockefeller Center? And strangely enough, it's very much a rink where they just go and skate around. So they were really quite impressed with us, which was unbelievable.
And I know that you've got a great collection of old footage from the holidays on ice. Do you ever pull that out and have a look at it?
Well, not really, because it's only 8mm, and Graham took it with a funny little Bell and Howell 8mm camera, and it's always been there. And we used to use it a lot when the kids were small. We'd show them, but of course once television came around, they probably didn't want to watch much of what Mum and Dad did. Not
Well,
impressed.
You and David have skated together, so. And does David still skate? Does he still get on the rink at all?
Yeah, he still skates a little bit, and he
Yeah.
roller skates as well.
Yeah, the rollerblades.
Rollerblades.
Ever been tempted by rollerblades?
Oh, I rollerblade. We went
you?
rollerblading at Venice Beach in the movie.
That's right, you were too.
I actually broke my wrist rollerblading.
Did you?
I'm a member of the Limelighters. They're the old, all the old showies, you know, the Tivoli girls. And we do a show once a year. And I was playing, I was the telegram boy. We did a skit on The Sound of Music, and I was the telegram boy. And I was skating on a very highly polished floor with the skates I had were racing skates. My feet went from under me and I landed on my wrist. So they carted me off to Monash, and they said, well, how did you break your wrist? I said, rollerblading. And I didn't get any sympathy from anybody. It was yuck, yuck. What were you doing at 70 rollerblading?
So, again, you said you're still a member of the Limelighters?
Yes.
And you still do the shows?
We do them on a smaller scale now. We used to do a full big production, but a lot of them are getting past putting the hours in the rehearsals, yes.
So you were lying when you told me you're leading a suburban life?
Just a little white one.
Thanks, Pat.